All right, I think we can get started now. Welcome everybody. Thank you guys for joining this webinar. I am Fahan. I'm the technical trainer for the Nordic team. I usually take care of Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Iceland. So I do a lot of webinars during this COVID period as well, and we're going to continue that even after. On daily basis, I do hands-on training here in our training room. I'm going to show you how it looks right now. Obviously, it's quite empty, just me. Apart from that, I do a lot of different tests in order to show you how the features are working from our cameras, from our NVRs, from a lot of our other devices as well. In order to be a benchmark for you guys, because we do have high requirements, so that's why it's important that we, as a Nordic team, are kind of a filter in order to make sure that the products that you get are properly tested by us as well. So today, the webinar is going to be about back to basics. I'm going to talk about how do we define a good camera? How do we compare them? Which terms do we need to understand in order to be able to compare them? Which different types of setups are there in terms of choosing the right camera and so on and so on? And the right settings for an NVR and so on and so on. So, and I'm going to push some of our products to the limit and even above. We've done that already. So I'm going to show you some of the results as well. But thank you all for joining in. Before we get started, I just want you all to go to your chat and where it says to all panelists, it should say to all panelists and attendees. So therefore, if we have something relevant in terms of the audio is missing or the picture is not there or anything, you guys can just write me right in there. So make sure to click where it says all panelists and attendees so that everybody can see each other's questions. So we're going to have a Q&A session. So I would love for all the questions to be answered afterwards. So if you have some questions, write them down and we're going to do it in the Q&A session at the end of it. So before we get started, I just want to let you guys know we are going to share all our content with you guys in terms of the PowerPoint, a couple of different tools I'm going to be mentioning, and also the recording of this webinar. So if there are some technical terms, some stuff that you don't really understand, no worries. We are going to share all of it with you. You can always rewind and look at what I was talking about. Maybe it's better to understand it twice or second time or whatsoever. While you are sitting and playing with the system, maybe some of those settings that I'm talking about, you can test out for yourself and see if how the difference is from the recordings and so on and so on. So no worries, we're going to share all of that and all of the webinar is recorded. Okay. So with no further ado, let's get started with the agenda. The first point is choosing the right camera. And in order to be able to choose the right camera, we need to define a good camera and what it's supposed to be used for, right? And second of all, then we are going to go to the settings. Which type of settings? We have stuff like compression we need to address. We have stuff like bitrate. Is it constant bitrate or is it variable bitrate? Stuff like these. I know that it has been quite difficult or challenging for many people who can't tell the difference about which settings is important for me to understand and use. So there's a lot of these buttons out there in the cameras, but if you don't understand them, then sometimes you're losing out on business, because at the end of this webinar, you should be able to understand all those different settings, which can give you a much better and stronger installation out there, which applies much less pressure to your NVR or to your infrastructure in terms of the transmission. So if everybody can see the PowerPoint and the audio is clear and you guys can see me as well. So let's get started with the next point. That is the choosing the right NVR, because one thing is to have a good camera, to define a good camera with the right settings. If we don't have the proper NVR to match it in terms of how many discs do we need or whatsoever, it's gonna be quite hard to satisfy the customer at the end of it. Then we're going to have a FAQ session. I wrote down a whole bunch of questions, which I thought were quite relevant in terms of when you are out there in the field installing. I already have a background of installing cameras before. So before I started joining Dahua approximately 3.5 years ago, I was out installing Dahua cameras before that. So I can relate to many of those different challenges you might be meeting out there in the field. So I'm going to address some of those things. And for sure, there's going to be questions that I haven't answered or put out there in the FAQ feel free to write it, and then I'm gonna add it as well so that we can always update this PowerPoint as well. And then at the end of it, Q&A session, so that you guys can just spray me with those different questions that are coming up to you during this webinar. So let's get started with the camera part. In order to define a good camera, we need to understand what an image consists of. How do we get a good image? Which different what to say things needs to be present in order for us to have a good image. Everything starts up with light, because light is actually the source of getting a good image. Then I'm talking about usually daytime image. If it's nighttime, you would usually use an IR camera, or if it was one of our full color cameras, which have a very, very high performance in terms of low light. So it doesn't require as much light to give you a very beautiful image in the night with colors. I remember when I was installing back in days, I used to laugh when people ask me like, but why isn't the image in color in the night? And I thought like, but you don't have any cameras that are running colored images in the night. You usually use IR, right? But obviously the end customers couldn't understand that because they didn't really know, right? So during the day, we usually use our white light, or what to say, natural light, and then we have the IR in the night when we are using cameras with IR. So there's a chart over here that explains the lux value, the value of, or the amount of light defined. So it's easier and what to say, understandable in some terms. It's easier to grasp whenever you're talking about different lighting conditions, because to say something is we have a lot of light or it's bright, it's a very wide definition, right? So therefore this chart is easy to understand, easy to see and reflect on. And as you can see, on a beautiful sunny day, usually we have approximately 50,000 lux, which gives us great grounds for good performance in terms of clear images. This is, sorry, Chris, this was, I couldn't stop remarking this one as British summer sunshine. I've always learned that it's approximately 100,000, but maybe it's limited to 50,000 in UK, but don't worry, the weather is not that different over here. So in terms of what to say, proving the fact that we need light in order to give us a great image, because what the light is doing is it's reflecting on different objects, and the reflection is captured by the camera, and therefore we get an image. I don't know if anybody of you guys know this color, the black color, black 3.0. Maybe you have seen it somewhere. I don't know. Anybody seen the black 3.0, as you call it? It does sound a little weird. I'm sorry. Yeah, I just got it. But anyway, what's special about this black color is because if you look at it right now, it looks as if I have taken an image, cut out this statue over here, and the same thing with the color, as if I've done some kind of trick with PowerPoint. In fact, I haven't. Because this is the black 3.0 is a color that absorbs 99.99% of the light. That means it does not reflect, more or less. So when it does not reflect, this is how it's going to be looking in regular lighting conditions, even outside. So as you can see, it's very hard for us to see on the darker statue or on the car, the shape and everything of the car, because all the light is absorbed. When you look at the person or the statue on the left side, then you'll see you have all the depth, all the nuances, different colors, and all of this shape. Because the reflection from the light is reflected into the camera, and then we can capture all of this light, and then we can get an image out of it. So this is actually just proving that if we didn't have any light, then we wouldn't have any picture. And it doesn't matter if it's IR or if it's natural light or white light or whatsoever. We need to have some kind of light source in order to have a proper image, or else there's nothing to reflect from. If we look at it from a perspective of comparing it to our brain, the camera is not that different. Because if you look at the camera, what's happening is the light is hitting the lens, and the lens is sent back to the retina, which is sending the signal over to the brain, which actually processes all of this. And then we have a clear image in the back of our mind. This just happens in milliseconds, just immediately. If you look at a camera, it's not any different. You have lens, sensor, and then processor. What actually happens is the camera is capturing all of that light that is hitting the lens, and from the lens, it's going directly to the sensor. And from the sensor, all of that light is changed into an electric signal, which is then sent back to our ISP and then processed so that we get an image out of it. So that's what actually happens, and it's not any different. So what we have to understand is when we have a lens, it's important that it's letting through enough light so that we can utilize this, because we need to see the light as a data source. So if we don't get enough data in hitting our sensor, which is sending it back, then we don't get a good image, because an image consists of data. So the more light, the more data we get, and the more data we get, the more details we get. So this is kind of how the technical part of it is. I'm not going to go deeper into this topic because this is just important for you guys to understand what actually happens. Then we have a couple of different things we need to think about when we are defining a good camera. That is the sensor size, because the sensor size is going to be determining how much of this data is going to be transferred over to our processing. So very small sensor, less amount of light can be processed, less amount of data we can get. Larger sensor, larger amount. And also a thumb rule is also, if you want to have good low light performance, you have to have a bigger sensor. And this term bigger is better because we want to capture as much light to give us a good image, right? So thumb rule, if you're looking for a good low light performance camera, make sure to look if the sensor is a 1/3 of an inch sensor. Usually, if you want to have a clear image in the night with colors, that sensor wouldn't do as well as the 1-inch sensor. So this is important to understand. Second of all, then we have something like pixel size. This is also important in order to understand how it benefits or decreases the quality in some terms. So let's go through some of the different options that we have. If we're choosing the right sensor, we have a lot of sunlight coming in. This was just done as an example. If we have a 2.9 ohm sensor, or sorry, pixel size, and the sensor size is 1/2.8 inch. If we then understand the amount of light that is captured into the sensor is defined as well by the lens, how much light is allowing, as I said before. If we then go to if we want to have a sensor that is bigger than that, but we want to make sure to keep the pixel size, because what happens if we change the pixel size is that usually we would be able, let's assume we go for a smaller pixel size. Then we could do with a smaller sensor in order to, get enough pixels to, fulfill the 4 megapixels. But what we did usually with our low light performance camera, which used to be, which are still in the Starlight, 2 megapixel with this size of sensor, which gives us good low light performance. In order to keep that low light performance, we have to make sure to keep the same pixel size. Because if we want to keep the same pixel size and we want to double the amount of pixels, and by the way, pixels are data points, right? As many pixels as we have, the more data we get. So, but the problem is also if we have in a lot of data, we need to make sure that is correct data. That's not noise. That's why we need to have a bigger pixel size. And in order to fit the same pixel size with the double amount, then obviously it adds up into a much larger sensor. As you can see, 1/1.8 inch. Have anybody tried some cameras for low light performance with this size of a sensor? Okay, I guess not. You guys can answer in the chat. It's only the Q&A that's left at the end. Okay? Okay. If we go to during the day, it's fine. We get lots of more details. Full color, depending on which one. Yeah, the 4 megapixel is the full color, but also the Starlight Plus uses the same sensor. And I'm going to show you the differences. 2 megapixel is great for lighting, but what the problem is with 2 megapixel, the fact that during the day you have a limited amount of pixels, right? So if you don't have enough pixels, then you cannot see the details on a longer distance. So therefore, if we had a higher, or what to say, higher resolution, 4 megapixel, the problem back in time when all the manufacturers were using 1/3 and some still, they were using 1/3 of an inch sensor. They increased the resolution from 2 megapixel to 4 megapixel, but the image was not as good in the nighttime because you had too small pixels in order to fit on that 1/3 of an inch sensor, so you wouldn't utilize that light good enough. Yes, it's 1/1.8 inch, yeah, for the 4 megapixel full color, yes, but not for the 2 megapixel. With the aperture, yeah, 1.0, and we're going to talk about what makes a difference. So it's important to understand 4 megapixel high resolution is good, but but we need to make sure that the sensor size is increasing in terms of the higher we go in resolution if we want to make sure to maintain that beautiful low light performance that we usually get in our 2 megapixel, right? So, because if we go over to the night image, if we have the 1/1.8 inch sensor, sorry, we don't have it in 2 megapixel, but this was just to give you an understanding, an example actually. And we go and compare it with the 4 megapixel, good low light performance still. It would have been better with the 2 megapixel, but obviously if you wanted to have 2 megapixel, then we would have to need even larger pixels, right? To be able to fulfill that sensor. So that would give us obviously even better low light performance. If we go over to the 4 megapixel, which is already performing very, very well in the low light performance, let's assume we keep the same sensor and go for a higher resolution. Let's go to 4K. What happens? What actually happens is the pixel size decreases. That means we need to have more light. But if the sensor is the same, why do we need more light? Because if you look at the walls over there, imagine when you have a lot of different pixels, then you have walls dividing these pixels. All of these walls are little by little blocking a little bit of light each. So the more walls you have, the more light they're blocking, the less light we are getting to hit our sensor from the lens. And then obviously we get a little bit less data. And that requires us to have if we wanted just as good low light performance in the 4K, we needed to have an even bigger sensor. So it's just to put them into relative terms in order to understand what happens when we keep on increasing. Bigger or higher resolution is not necessarily better. So if you ask me, like a thumb rule, if you wanted to have good low light performance and also very good detailings for a significant distance, the new benchmark would be 4 megapixel, the 4 megapixel cameras that we're using with 1/1.8 inch sensor. So I hope that made sense to you guys, that you understood the difference and why and so on and so on. If we want the same low light performance as the 2 megapixel or 4 megapixel, we need to increase the sensor size. So just to put them into relative terms again, to give you a proof of concept about what happens when we just go from 1/3 of an inch sensor to 1/1.8. So that means almost a little bigger than half-inch sensor. Even though these terms, or what to say, these numbers seem to be insignificant because it doesn't look like a big difference, this is how it looks. In this case, we were doing a test during a event that we had for a distributor where we actually had a dark room prepared, more or less. It's not that kind of dark room as you guys are thinking. We blocked off all the light, more or less all the light from the windows, just to show you guys the difference in a real scenario when there was no trickery, nothing. That's why we did it during the event, so people could see for themselves how dark it is. We removed all the IR because IR is the, what to say, helping hand of the sensor. IR is great, I'm not saying that, but if we really want to compare something, put it out there, remove all the helping settings like the IR and everything, and look how strong the sensor is and how well it's utilizing that little amount of light you have out there. Then you're going to see how good the sensor is, and then you have good grounds of using IR as well, and so on and so on. So This was an example with the 4 megapixel, the older 4 megapixel that was used with a 1/3 of an inch sensor. This is how dark it was in there in the room. The guy was standing at the door. He couldn't even see what was on the shelves on the left-hand side. It was that dark. We blocked almost all the light from the windows. I even brought a small bit of lamp just to add a little bit of light, just to utilize it. Because if we had no light whatsoever, like zero looks, then we're not going to get anything out of it. So then we turned over to the new generation with the 4 megapixel. By the way, this is the same conditions. We didn't change a thing. 2 different cameras, same room, same conditions. The performance is just different. So it's just to give you an understanding about how well the larger sensor performs with the same amount of pixels. So sensor size is a big deal. It makes a huge difference. As you can see, the guy is standing there watching around. He can't see anything, even across the shelves. But if we look at the image, we can see all the bottles, we can see the shape, or we can almost see the different brands of bottles, where they're from. So this is how the sensor size has an effect on the image, how well it can utilize the light that is the limited amount of light that's there. And by the way, I didn't even use the lamp. It was just to give you an idea. So second part is the aperture, because as I said, we need to have a sensor, or what to say, a lens that is allowing as much light to pass through as possible, because the more light we get in, the more data, as I said, the more we can utilize again. Yeah, exactly. It is a wow effect, Dino. Yeah. So when we go for our full color cameras, the general thumb rule for a full color camera is that it's using an aperture of 1.0. That means it's utilizing 100% light. That's how you get this amazing low light performance, because it is much clearer than we could see with our own naked eye when we are looking out there compared to the camera. So usually all of these full color cameras are great. The only thing that is limiting a little bit is the fact that we don't have such a good depth of field, but since we are using a fixed lens, then obviously it doesn't really apply to it. So it's going to be fine. So it actually shows over here, because if you compare a lot of different cameras and sensors and so on, you also have to compare the aperture. If you're not comparing the aperture on a, what to say, fair grounds, or the same aperture, comparing it with the low light performance, then you will never get the same outcome, because you are comparing apples with oranges, right? So the aperture is important to understand how to compare them. There is actually a small chart over here I added as well as the tool. Let me just show you guys how it looks. Hope you guys can see the chart over here. So there's this small tool which actually helps us to define the differences between the sensors when we just play around with the aperture. So if you have, for instance, an aperture of 1.0, which is the full color, and you have an aperture of 1.4, which is very common, or 1.6. So that means there is a 50% amount of light that is not getting to the sensor, which means that we are losing a lot of data. So this is very important to understand. If you're comparing things, you need to compare them on the same level. If you're comparing a aperture of 1.0 with the same sensor size, a different camera, but with an aperture of 1.6, obviously the full color camera is going to outperform it in the low light performance, because it is getting lots of more light. As you can see, only 39% of light is getting to the 1.6 aperture camera compared to, or the lens compared to the full color with 1.0. So if you don't understand this, this is going to be very difficult for you to be able to compare different cameras. So this is important to understand and keep in mind. So let's try to compare why. I assume that many of you guys have been asking yourself this question: what are the pros and cons about full color or about Starlight Plus? Which one should I be using, right? Anybody been thinking about it? I have, for sure. Yes, the Excel is already going to be in the link that I'm going to share at the end. So I guess I'm the only one who've been thinking about, so how is the full color compared to the Starlight Plus? Which one is better, or what are the pros and cons about them? If I'm looking at the pros and cons compared to the Starlight Plus, what benefits do I get from full color? First of all, since the full color camera, yeah, that's great. And I think full color is wonderful. I'm not saying that it's not good. I'm just saying that people need to understand the cons and pros about full color or Starlight Plus exactly. So the biggest benefit of full color is obviously that we have 24/7 colored image. So that means no matter which time of the day, we will always have a colored image. Second of all is the reflection. We don't have any reflection. Have anybody tried reflection from IR with a camera that's installed outside, running in motion detection, and it's running the IR in the night, and it's recording by motion detection? Is it useful, the recording? We're going to talk about that ghosting, don't worry. False alarms, yes, we will get a lot of insignificant recording from a camera with IR because the IR is getting the rain to trigger because it's reflecting. So the rain is going to be triggering our motion detection. And then we get a lot of data that's not important to us or recording that's not important to us. This we will not get from the full color. Since this one does not have IR, then we are not reflecting any light from the rain. That means very, very clear image, even if the burglar is moving around in the night where it's heavy rain, we will still get a beautiful, clear image with the full color. And then we have the EPOE. Obviously, in the full color range, we have EPOE also in the Starlight Plus. But the benefit from using a full color with EPOE is that we can actually add more cameras to it, to a NVR or a switch, because we are using much less. The power consumption is much less for a full color camera because it doesn't have IR. If you go to our 4 megapixel, the flagship of the full color 5449, it uses 4.4 watts. So that's very, very low amount of watt for a 4 megapixel camera that has that much analytics in it. We have models with white light, which means that we do get a colored image even if it's pitch black. So that's a possible. We have very high sensitivity in the full color. That's why we can get those clear images in the night. Invisible installation. Why? Because when you have a camera that does not have any IR, then it does not show itself. So that could be kind of a pro and con. For some people, they would rather not want the burglar to see where the camera is installed. I would personally prefer for it to be invisible so that I could get very good images. So the burglar doesn't know where he needs to hide his face or where he needs to look away. So the invisible installation is definitely a pro for me. I don't know why I wrote no reflection in the con over there in the full color. That's my mistake, sorry. Strong direct light can be a downside of the full color because since it's that sensitive, if you have a strong light source immediately like a flashlight, then the camera will have to have a couple of seconds to adapt to that lighting because the camera is so sensitive, it's going to be sucking up all that light and utilizing it. But when you have such a strong light source in the night immediately appearing, then it's going to be a little bit difficult for the full color camera to adapt to it as quick as the Starlight Plus cameras with the IR. And it's a con for some people who would say that it's only with a fixed lens. It's actually on purpose, and I wouldn't really call it a con because if you wanted to have a aperture of 1.0 in a full color camera, the camera housing would be too small. You would need a much bigger lens in order to keep an aperture that is so wide when it's zoomed in completely. So that's why it's built with a fixed lens, and that's how it's going to be. And the downside is if it's completely pitch black, if you have no light whatsoever, then you won't get any good image out of it. If you have too low amount of light, I'm not saying that you have to have a projector. If you just have the regular light that you would have on a house, like on the side of the house, it's usually more than enough. but if it's pitch black, you won't get anything out of it. Or if it's such a low amount of light, then you would have this, as Pelle is talking about, there is a ghosting effect in it. And why is that? Because if we had the aperture that is utilizing all the lights that's available, we have a long exposure time in order to get us a good low light performance. Then you would have, when people are moving, you would have a little bit of a ghosting. What I would prefer to use is, I would actually just add a small bit of light that could turn on during the night. You can have these different sensors that are turning on the light in the evening automatically. So it's determining the lux value and then turning on the light on my house. Not a strong amount of light, but that's usually more than enough, and you'll get a beautiful colored image anyway, and you won't get that ghosting effect. So then we have the Starlight Plus IR in the night. That means we will get even more crisp, clear images. So we won't have any ghosting because we have lots of amount of light. So we don't have to have such a, long exposure time. We can have a shorter exposure time, which gives us a more clear scenario of the person, or a description of the person. And the analysis in like almost pitch black is better with the Starlight Plus, because we get, as I just said, we don't have any ghosting whatsoever. Just a question. Could we have the questions at the end? Because then it's a little bit easier for me, because I remember the last webinar that I had, we had questions for, I think we have like 30 or 40 questions during the webinar, and then the time was very limited. So I hope that's okay. We have the fixed and varifocal. That means we have a lot of different variety in order to choose and limit the area, the field of view where we want to concentrate or focus our pixels, because the more we focus them, the more significant data we will get, the better a description we will get, the more clear a face picture, details in the face we'll be able to get of the burglar, right? So, and then the range appearance. The Starlight, the full color only comes in a dome and a bullet. Now also eyeball, by the way, or turret. The Starlight Plus comes in PDZs as well. A lot of different other cameras as well, the panoramic cameras as well. So downside is IR reflection, as we said, and no colors in the night. So it's going to be a little bit harder to describe. Sorry, I think this one was a mistake. My bad. So that was the difference between, I hope that clarified something for a couple of you guys. As I said, you're going to get the PowerPoint. That's why I wrote them like this in different points. I usually hate tables where you have a lot of writing, but I think I have had the request many times where people want to be able to compare them one by one. But the best way of comparing a camera, no matter brand, is connect it, understand the settings as we are talking about now, connect it and evaluate by yourself. That's the best comparison you would ever get. So one thing is if you understand the data sheet and so on, but if you don't connect them and compare them, then at the end of the day, you're not really sure what's going on. So then we have, in terms of choosing different appearances in terms of, is it a dome camera, bullet camera, turret camera, which one do I need, when do I need it, and what are the pros and cons? So as you can see, when we look at the dome camera, the pro is, first of all, that it's a IK10 classified camera. So that means it's completely vandal proof. It can be installed quite low or in harsh environments where we might have people vandalizing cameras quite often. Hope it's nowhere, but it happens every once in a while. So their dome shapes are very suitable for it. They are even better to blend in as well for different installations. They have a very good blending appearance, and generally people prefer dome cameras. Anybody here preferring dome cameras? And some models are able to be installed without the pigtail as well. I know some people think that it's very difficult to manage sometimes the pigtail of the camera. It's just a matter of which camera you're using or which accessory you're using together with it. And then not obvious always where it's pointing. That could be a subjective point of view in terms of what you think. Some people think it's a pro, some think it's a con. When we're talking about the cons, which I think are stuff like the harsh environments, exactly. The adjustment can be a little bit more difficult than the other cameras when you have a dome shape, because it's a little bit more, complicated. You have to remove the 3 screws of the dome camera. First of all, the glass. Then you have to do the adjustments. And then we get to the next point. You're exposing the electronics for, you're exposing it to humidity and other different things. You're exposing the electronics in terms of if somebody pulls a cable they're not supposed to, or twisting the camera around too many times, then sometimes these plugs fall out. So this is also another downside of it, if you don't know how to install them, obviously. Sensitive to IR. Anybody have had an issue with reflections or bouncing IR into the camera? Nobody, I guess? Wow, that was fast. Oh, I can see there's a weak spot here. Yeah, people can relate to it, yeah. I've tried that as well with many different installations, and it doesn't matter which brand or whatsoever. Dome cameras are more reluctant to have reflections than bullet cameras or turret cameras. That's a very obvious thing. Fix it. I would prefer to just use another housing if you ask me. But if you use a full color camera, you don't have that issue with the dome camera because there's no reflection. So that was the fix, Casper. So when we're talking about the reflection of it, apart from that is the dirt effect performance. The dirt affects the performance much faster because if you have a small amount of dirt at the glass, then the reflection is going to get much worse, or even the image is generally much more affected when you have a little amount of dirt. Yeah, that could also be a way to deal with it. But in general, if you have a dome rounded shaped glass, then it's also more difficult to penetrate with IR than you have a flat glass, right? So, but that could be subjective as well. So I would personally prefer to zoom in every time the camera to what is the region of interest instead of just watching a wide angle. We're going to get to that afterwards. Then we have the bullet shape. First of all, very easy to adjust. You have one screw adjustment. You have an easier way if you want to exchange the SD card. If you want to reset it, you have longer IR ranges. Still have vandal proof. If you are talking about the new bullet in the H shape, then it's still IK10 classified. It's easy enough to install without the pigtail as well for some models, depending which you choose. Longer ranges. You do have domes and bullets in similar type of ranges in terms of zooming. But I would generally, if it's long distance, I would generally prefer to have bullets because the image is a little bit more clear when you have flat glass compared to if you have rounded glass. Then we have the downside of it. It's obvious where it's pointing, subjective as well. Some people like that, some don't. It's a little bit more bulky. You can't install it in a very low height because then it would be more, what to say, the vandalism would be more obvious for it to be applied to. And usually it's installed higher and mostly for outdoor use. When we get to my favorite, anybody else has the favorite of a turret camera for the housing? The list is much longer, but just to make it clear, we have the same one screw adjustment, much easier to adjust just one screw if you're not happy with the angle or what to say where, yeah, eyeball as well, as it's called. And then you also have easier ways to reset compared to the dome shape, easier to exchange the SD card. You have a small hatch in all our newer turret shaped cameras or eyeball shaped cameras. The best thing about an eyeball camera is the fact that from once you install it, it goes the same with the bullet as well. Once you get the camera and you finish the installation, you have never exposed it to humidity or any other different kind of environmental conditions. It is completely closed from once it leaves the factory to once the installation is finished. So you're never exposing the electronics, or if you're adjusting it, you're not exposing the electronics. So that is one of the biggest benefits. And the fact that it's easy to install vertically or horizontally. So that means you don't have to have lots of different accessories necessarily as you would have with a dome camera. And bear in mind, I'm talking about the general appearance. Doesn't matter which brand it is. So the downside of it is if you're talking about the smaller ones, you'd have to have a junction box, but as long as it's there, I wouldn't really call it a downside. Then we have the fact that it's not a vandal-proof camera. It's not a IK10 classified, but if you ask me, it's very, very sturdy. I would definitely prefer to install those anyway, but obviously if you have a tender which is limiting you, then it's going to be a little bit difficult to add that to the tender, which says, maybe it says the camera has to be IK10 classified, then obviously the turret camera can't be used. So then we have the different pros and cons about traditional fisheye panoramic cameras. Which one would I prefer, when, and so on and so on. The pro of it would be, first of all, that I could install more cameras, because the traditional cameras are usually a little bit more cost effective than the fisheye or panoramic camera. It takes 10 hits with a large hammer, yeah, Casper says, for the eyeball or for the dome or whichever you're talking about. It's a matter of the size of hammer, yeah, first of all. And second of all, usually you would have a clear image of the person before he is vandalizing this camera. I have seen many recordings from backups that I had made previously, and we have already been able to recognize the person far before he started hitting the camera. And in many situations, what happens is, even if the camera is hit severely, then the angle is changed a little bit. The camera usually works. So, but obviously the traditional camera is a little bit more cost effective. So we can usually, for that budget, we are able to set up more cameras. We have multiple angles. So that's a good side of it. So we will get that person that we are trying to cover with our CCTV from multiple angles. So if he's turning his head, no worries, since we have more cameras, more angles, we will get a easier description. Field of view ratio is better. I'm going to show you a little bit what I'm talking about, since we can zoom it in and choose to have a field of view that is smaller, but with the same amount of pixels, we'll get a lot of data. And we're going to go a little bit deeper into that. Lens bending image, depending on lens. The wider you have, then you will sometimes see a little bit of a bending effect. You can choose which one of them you want for the bullet shape. Sometimes if you are zooming in a lot, you won't have that. So IK10 is not so important. No, for me neither. Only if it's a tender, or else I would be able to try to explain to them that we are talking about a very sturdy camera, which is much more suitable in many cases than dome shapes. So for me personally, I don't think that the IK10 is that important, but it's depending on which customer, which tender. And I think it's important to go into a dialogue with some of those customers who think they need IK10. Maybe they wouldn't really need it. So these are the different things I want you to pin out for them. And that's also why you can use the PPT. Maybe I'm sure you have lots of other points than me, but I just try to make it a little bit clear for you guys. So closer to objects, again, the same resolution ratio is better. It's less vulnerable. If one breaks, the other ones usually would record. So we are not kind of having the issue with all the eggs in one basket, not just one fisheye, where if this one is down, then everything is lost. We don't have any CCTV. We can set up different rules to trigger with the traditional cameras. If one goes down, we get an email or notification, and then we know we need to go fix something, but at least we have other cameras that are still recording in that area. So at least we know that we are quite safe. Not that we don't have to go and repair it. So lower decoding capacity needed, because we have usually a little bit lower resolution than we would have with fisheye cameras or panoramic camera. Very focal, pixel focused on regions of interest, as I said before. The downside of it, wiring each one of them usually has a higher labor cost, but if you're using some of these PFT 1300, I don't know if some of you guys know them. These are the ones you can use, where you connect one PoE cable, and then you can split it into two. And then you can wire it another 100 meters. You can have one camera and then wire it another 100 meters, and then you can have two more cameras. So the wiring can actually somewhat be figured out with using the right accessories. But in general, more wiring, higher labor cost, that's a downside. And the fact that you would have sometimes blind angles with traditional cameras. Usually if you are pointing it in some direction, if you're standing right under the camera, then you don't have a clear image, obviously, or you can't see that person because the angle is not wide enough, or what to say, you can't see like you can with a fisheye, all of it. If we go over to the fisheye, we have the 360 degrees. That means we have no blind angles. We don't have any areas that are not covered. We can save a lot of labor cost. One camera installed, that's it. And wider angle allows us to have a lower installation height, but still be able to cover everything. So, and the fact that it only takes up one channel in the VMS, so you can cover a wider area for viewing with one camera in the VMS license compared to if you had traditional cameras. The downside of it is higher resolution, even though sometimes people would make the mistake of thinking, all right, I have a fisheye camera that's 12 megapixel, it covers everything, I can zoom in and out, and that's great. That's not the problem. The problem is if you try to compare it with a traditional camera and calculate the ratio for the resolution, then you would have to divide it by 4. Because usually with a traditional camera, you would have the angle of approximately 90 degrees, depending on which lens you're choosing. If it's 3.6, you would have usually approximately 89 degrees, right? But then you would have in the traditional camera 204 megapixel, or even higher. The fisheye is limited to, if it's a 12 megapixel, to 3 megapixels for the 90 degrees, because we would have to divide the 360 degrees into 4 in order to be able to have some kind of comparable result with the traditional cameras. So this is just important to keep in mind, that just because you have a 12 megapixel camera doesn't necessarily mean you get more details, because you're usually also covering a larger area. So you would have to calculate that in order to get compare the resolution. Higher decoding capacity is needed. That means you have to have a stronger NVR in order to decode this fisheye image and also do the dewarping. You only have it in fixed lens. I wouldn't really call it a con, because it doesn't make sense to have a zoomed lens when you have a fisheye view, because during the dewarping, you could always kind of digitally zoom around. Not suitable for outdoor use, because the longer we go, the harder it is to determine the person, or what to say, see the details, because we wouldn't have enough pixels, or what to say, in most cases, half of the image, if you're installing it at the wall, outside on the wall, or with a bracket, half the image is useless. So that means we are actually paying for 6 megapixels, half of it, 180 degrees, that we are not utilizing, right? But at least we are getting the no blind angle. And you would usually have the bending shape more when you look at the rounded picture. If you're not dewarping, that's just going to be a round image. But once you dewarp, then it's not a problem whatsoever. Then we have the panoramic. They come in a couple of different functionalities. We have the regular panoramic, that's 180 degrees. The good thing about it is low installation cost, just like the fisheye camera. Takes up one channel in the VMS. In the same way, we have a lot of the same benefits from the traditional and the fisheye cameras, because this image is stitched together, containing multiple sensors. So they are stitched together, and then you get this 180-degree image, and it gives you a great overview of a bigger area. Downside of it is usually it's a higher cost, because it's a more expensive camera. You have to install it significantly higher in order to utilize the function. And sometimes it is subjective to reflections a little bit easier than a traditional camera, because it's multiple cameras connected together, and you'd be able to see the stitching more easily. When we talk about the panoramic camera on the right-hand side, that camera consists of separated sensors, multiple sensors, with a separated channel. So first of all, we can decide where we want these cameras to point, so we can turn them. It has a rounded rail where you can move these cameras back and forth. It is with a zoom lens, so that means you can zoom in and choose which is your region of interest, so you're not wasting any pixels. You have a separated stream, depending on, I would say that's subjective as well. If you have an NVR, some people like it when it's separated with each individual channel. So that's possible with this type of panoramic camera. Adjustment of the angle is much easier, since you can turn them around and zoom in and out. And you can cover shorter angles with one sensor, longer angles with longer distances with another sensor. Then you're utilizing all those pixels that are available much better than anything else. Again, downside of it is higher cost. It also takes, I think I forgot to add that one. It takes one channel each for each of the channels this camera has. In this case, 4 channels. Then you would have to pay with 4 channels in the VMS. So that would be a downside of it. And all eggs in one basket. As I said before, if this camera breaks, then you don't have any images whatsoever in that area. So then we have to talk a little bit about the resolution part, the pros and cons about them. Low resolution versus higher resolution. So low resolution is usually what we would have used in low light performance, because we are utilizing, again, all the pixels for the right amount of light that we are getting. And then obviously it's easier to decode a lower resolution when we want to display it on our screen. They are cheaper usually. In most cases, they are cheaper. Determining the sensor, obviously, that would make it a little bit more expensive. But the ratio between the resolution and sensor would be better priced than if you had a much higher resolution. Then you have better low light performance. That's a general thumb rule. As I mentioned before, you would have less walls in between the pixels. And obviously, in most cases, you would have a bigger sensor, so you would get better low light performance, as Chris also mentioned. Less storage is needed because you have lower resolution. Transmission capability is not to forget. The higher resolution we have, the more transmission capability we need. The switches has to be gigabit switches. If we are doing a daisy chains with a lot of different cameras going through each other, then we need to think about the transmission. If we have a very high resolution, then that could also be limiting if we're only running megabit. So if we go to the cons of it, more cameras needed to cover a larger area, because once we zoom in, then the clarity is not as good, especially during the day. The region of interest has to be more accurate. We have to zoom in even more in order to utilize the pixels. The high resolution, the benefits of it is we need to have less cameras, less labor costs to cover a much larger area. If we had a 4K camera, then we could significantly zoom in much more, or 12 megapixel camera. When we are talking about even digitalized. So that means after the recording, and still get a clear description of the perpetrator or the burglar whatsoever. Better detailing, better coverage for larger areas, yeah. Bigger sensors needed for low light performance. We already talked about it. Heavier to process. That means decoding capacity has to be stronger in order, if we want to look at the images all of the time, live view in the mainstream, capability has to be higher. If we usually one of the bigger misinterpretations that happen is I need a wide range to cover everything, but when I zoom in, the details are not clear. Have anybody heard that from end customers or tried this by themselves, where they're using a 2.8 millimeter lens, which is covering what, say 110 degrees quite widely? Because what usually happens is, once you look at the image and zoom in, you don't get those clear pictures, because what happens is when you have this situation, even if it's a 4 megapixel camera, we have this resolution divided by 4, kind of to give you an understanding. So that means for approximately 30 degrees, you only have 1 megapixel. So the more you zoom in, the worse the picture gets, the faster, because you have a wider angle. So in my opinion, I would usually prefer, if it's a regular, standard outdoor scenario, I would prefer to have a 6 millimeter lens, or at least 3.6. I wouldn't go to 2.8. That's completely up to people. You guys just need to understand which cons there are or benefits there are if you're using a wider or a more narrow lens. Because if we go to this picture, and if I zoom in, this is just to give you an example. This actually shows, this is a different camera. This just shows whenever we zoom in to that picture, the amount of pixels that are covering my face are a smaller amount. That would be, I would say, approximately some 50 pixels, right? Well, what about if we go to a narrower lens with the same amount of pixels, which is only 56 degrees approximately? Then we would have almost the double amount of pixels. That means the wider angle gives us less details at distance for identification. So if I zoom in at my face, in the same way, this is just as an example. So as you can see, my face now consists of multiple hundreds of pixels, which gives us even better detailing. Yes, exactly. As Chris says, that you will utilize all of your pixels much better like this when you understand what are the cons and pros about the different lenses that you're using. So another thing that has come across me a couple of times is when people have this type of image. Have anybody tried this? This type of situation to the right-hand side where you don't have a clear image? When a car is passing through, or it's during the night and a person is moving around and you have this blurring effect, or what to say, this pulled image where you can't see the face clearly. Nobody tried this before, or nobody had this issue before? I guess not. Okay. Okay, at least Chris had this issue before, and it has been addressed as well to me by many different customers who don't really understand it. So what usually happens is customer comes in, they have faster moving objects, which humans are sometimes, or faster moving object could be referred to more as cars, I would say. So then usually I need a higher frame rate, right? I need to run with 60 frames, right? Am I right or am I wrong? So I need even lower frame rates. Generally, we are looking at a complete different direction. I can see many people are hesitating. They want to say yes, but at the same time, when I'm asking like this in a tricky question, it could be wrong, right? Yeah, because usually 25 frames, Dino, is more than enough. As Dino says, my camera only go to 25 frames. Usually have a definition where the difference is if we are talking NTSC standard that they usually use in the US compared to here in Europe. We usually have the PAL standard. So the maximum frame rate in the NTSC is 60 frames. And here in the PAL standard, we are using 50 frames as the maximum for our cameras, or 25 frames and 30 frames when we are talking about the other cameras. So we are looking at in the wrong direction when we think that we need a higher frame rate, because what we actually need is adjust the shutter speed. And what happens when I'm talking about adjusting the shutter speed? I'm talking about the exposure time. So the lower the exposure time, the more light we are letting in, but the more ghosting effect or blurring effect you would usually have those person, or if you take your smartphone and you start taking a picture of a person running, then usually that person wouldn't be as clear because of the shutter speed again. So what the shutter speed means, the higher we set up the shutter speed, the faster the camera is blinking, what to say, and the longer time the camera is, or what to say, the less light is going to the sensor. So that means the higher shutter speed we get, we might get a clearer image of the person running, but we will get a darker image. That's why we need to reconsider if we have a sensor that is large enough to utilize all that light. So if we have a large enough sensor, which the 1/1.8 is usually in most cases, then we can increase the shutter speed and even get a clearer image without losing any of the details, and still get a what to say, brighter image in the night than many other cameras, because they would usually have a smaller sensor. The other downside, and yes, you could even sell with much less frames, Pelle. So that's kind of true, but looking in the frame rate is usually the wrong direction. And the downside of increasing the frame rate is as well more transmission, more decoding capacity. So what to say, we are trying to fill a void that is not even there. So we are looking in the complete different wrong direction. So reconsider the sensor. If we already know that this is going to be used for what to say, environments where it's getting darker, or what to say, instead of indoor where it's a factory where there's always visible light, then we need to think about the shutter speed and reconsider the sensor. I hope that's clear. So with different lighting conditions, usually we would use a functionality that is called double VDR. So what double VDR does, it takes two different exposures of the darkest areas of the image and the brightest area of the image. And then it combines them. And once it's combined, then we will see that the image looks like on the right-hand side. The left side is without the double VDR enabled. So as you can see, the image is much brighter on both situations. We would see the things outside the window is much more clear. And inside at the carpet in the corners where it's usually much darker, you would still get a much more clear image because we are using double VDR. So where would you use double VDR? Double VDR usually, for instance, at supermarket entrances is a very, very common example. Since we are merging a fast exposure and a long exposure together in order to get a very clear image, when we have very fast moving objects, it's usually not preferred to use double VDR because you would not get as clear image. What I would prefer to do is I would make sure that the lighting conditions were better, so I wouldn't have to use double VDR when we have fast moving objects, because it's the short and long exposure that's merged together. So we would use it at supermarket entrances because many times we have strong light coming from outside. In Europe or in Scandinavia, it's usually the brightest day would be 100,000 lux. And then you have much less light inside, and then the image would usually appear much darker inside if we increase the brightness of the camera, the white balance of the camera, so that it's bright enough inside. Then usually outside it's too bright, then you can't see any details or anything outside. So when we use the double VDR, it compensates for both those things. But when we're talking about double VDR, you have a couple of different levels. You have obviously digital double VDR, which is much worse than real double VDR, which actually just does it by software based, but the double VDR does it mechanically inside the camera with different exposures. So some cameras, they come with a double VDR of 120. And if you look at most of our 5 series, they have a 140 dB. So what more could be even better than the double VDR with 2 exposures, 3 exposures? So the ultra double VDR, as we would call it, would give us 3 different exposures where it's giving us with a medium shutter speed, so that when we have a little bit faster moving objects, the camera would actually deal with it even better. So 140 dB is even better at these tough conditions where we have strong light. And this is very important when we compare with other manufacturers. Make sure to look at some of these details and consider them where you're installing the camera. So then we have something about bitrate, CBR and VBR. Has it been confusing to some people? Sometimes CBR, VBR, what do I need? When do I need it? It should end at 11:30 from my knowledge. But anyway, it's recording, so you're free to leave. Okay. Bitrate is determined by the amount of data encoded per second. So it kind of looks like this when we're talking about the bitrate. The higher quality you need, the bigger the file size, as you can see from the table, the higher bitrate you go, the bigger the size of it. So first of all, if you go to a standard 2 megapixel camera, usually the newest cameras, they come with a pre-configured compression of H.265, then you have a lower bit rate. But anyway, if you try to look at the bit rate, which is set by default or was set by default to 4 Mbps for a 2 megapixel camera before, then the space needed would be a 0.5 megabit per second. So if you go to the 8 megapixel with this bit rate, the 8 megabit, then usually that would take up 1 megabyte. So that means higher and higher amount of storage needed, stronger transmission is needed in order to give us the image needed for different resolutions. So, and this is a very common misunderstanding. People misunderstand the
bits with the bytes. So this is important not to get mixed up in between. So when we talk about the constant bit rate, we would usually use that with a lower resolution. With higher with higher resolution, we would always prefer to use variable bit rate. Let's dig a little bit deeper into it. When we look at the different bit rates, this is just an example from some of my recordings over here. You can see the variable bit rate in the two top channels. You can see it's going up and down. The bit rates on channel 3 and 4 is fixed. That means it's always going to go to that amount of bit rate that we have set. In this case, I've set the bit rate to the maximum of the 4K cameras. That's the 8 megabit. So the camera bit rate will always be the constant, and we will waste a lot of bandwidth, because if you have a static image, you won't need the maximum amount of quality. Usually you need the quality to be very high when it's significant, when you have moving objects, right? Not the static images. So VBR, CBR differences, the pros and cons, or what to say, not the pros and cons, the differences between them is the CBR, which is the quicker encoding, wider compatibility, because many different programs, stuff, they don't always support VBR, variable bitrate, compared to constant bitrate. You always get the same amount of quality. That doesn't mean the best quality necessarily, because in my case, I was using the maximum bitrate. So that is the best quality, of course. But if I had set my bitrate as a maximum of 4 megabits for a 8 megapixel camera, then even though the bitrate wanted to exceed in order to utilize the full capacity of the camera in terms of giving us the best detailing, I'm limiting it with my constant bitrate. So in that case, the VBR would be better, because I want to go higher when it's significant. And when it's not significant, I want to go lower than my constant bitrate. So usually it's best for streaming, because many different streaming platforms, they don't do well with variable bitrate. So we want to have the same amount of details, the quality, when we are using constant bitrate. With the variable bitrate, usually it's most efficient when we have more static environments, because the more static it is, the lower the bitrate will go automatically. And then I would usually prefer to run the bitrate with the highest performance of the camera, because since I'm paying for a camera that has this amount of quality, it's kind of like if I have a Ferrari and it goes like 300 kilometers an hour as the maximum speed, and I'm driving on the highway, obviously I would rather want to utilize those horsepowers available, right? So when it's not suitable, then I will adjust to the traffic. Depending if it's the German Autobahn, maybe I would go a little bit faster, but it just says, if you already bought a Ferrari, why not use the full capacity of that Ferrari? This is what variable bitrate gives you. Okay, I hope that's clear. Not to forget, you will also utilize the space much better, because you need less space in order to have good quality when it's needed with variable bitrate. Because in most cases, when we have CCTV cameras installed, like in private homes outside, you have lots of static environment, which is not significant to keep in a very high quality, or what to say, to keep being refreshed all the time. That's why variable bitrate will use much less storage space. And the bitrate is decided by dynamics in the picture. So the more movement, the higher the bitrate will go. Once the movement is done, it will decrease again. So it's kind of like an autopilot function, which works much better than constant bitrate. And definitely I would recommend this in most cases. So as you can see, let me just give you an example. As you can see from my camera over here, hope you guys can see that I have a couple of cameras mounted over there. Can you guys see that? Or let me pull it up from the camera. I hope you guys can see that we transformed our training room to a monitoring station. As you can see here, we have lots of different cameras. I installed approximately 32. Just to give you an example of how it looks when we push the NVRs to above the limit, okay? So let me just try to show you what happens when I'm trying to use these different settings with variable bitrate and constant bitrate. So let me show you the, I guess you guys can see the, let me just go back again. I guess now you guys can see the screen. It's not significant that you see everything. And then I'm gonna go over to my NVR to show you how it looks with the constant and variable bitrate, how it affects it. I have my NVR right here. I hope that's clear for everybody to see. Okay, I hope everybody can see my NVR running right here. So from my different settings, you can see in the name in the bottom, I listed them as 4K with H.264 compression and then variable bitrate, and then constant bitrate, and then H.265 with variable bitrate, and so on and so on. I gave you a lot of different options. So let me just try to move around in front of the camera and show you the difference with variable bitrate and constant bitrate, how it actually plays out in the bit rates of the cameras. So this is showing the amount of bitrate that's being used. As you can see, the variable bitrate camera 1 and 3. Let me just go and check that again. Camera 1 and camera 3. The only difference is that it's running H.264 and H.265, but it's variable bitrate compared to channel 2 and 4 that are both running constant bitrate, but with H.264 and H.265. So let's go over here. And let me just try to turn around my tower over here. Oh, it's heavy. So now I have a quite static area. Let me just move out of it and try to look at the bit rates, how it's acting up. As you can see, it's decreasing significantly. You can see 1 and 3 compared to 2 and 4. Because this one is set to a maximum bitrate of 8 megabits, so it's going to be running constantly. And as you can see, the ones that are a little bit higher, the top one and the third one is going much lower. The fifth one is running H.265 plus. I'm going to talk about that afterwards. So once I am going to be standing in front of the camera, look at the difference in terms of the bitrate, how it's going to act up. So now I'm disturbing all the static environment and I'm getting all the cameras to start recording and refresh the image constantly, completely. And you can see from the, I hope you could see it at least, from the graphs, that it's going significantly higher and lower once I'm out of the picture, right? So this shows how much better it is to run with variable bitrate. When you have a lot of movement, all of a sudden it will start peaking and we won't lose anything. We will get the best detailing available out there and not wasting all of the bandwidth, the storage space with insignificant data. So I hope that was clear for everybody to see. So then we have the, just give me a sec. Yeah, the compression rate. So when we're talking about compression rates, we have 3 different compressions. I don't know if it's clear for everybody how they are in different ways. The H.264 is the most commonly used, compression out there, which is compatible with more or less everything out there. So then you have the H.265, which will compress it to half of the size, because it will keep the the difference between the H.264 and H.265 is that the iframe, which is the whole picture, it will draw the whole picture more often in H.264 compared to H.265. It will keep the whole picture instead of just drawing it all the time. That means it's only going to be drawing the significant areas, just like H.264, but it won't do it as often as H.264, the whole area. So I hope it's clear. You can read about the H.264 and H.265 if you need it more detailed. H.265 has been implemented in all our NVRs since, I think, 2017 or something. So it is, I think it's becoming a wider standard first now with different competitors compared to what Dahua was doing already. So when you have the H.265, another thing is, once you have, let's assume the static image, the H.265 will divide these areas into bigger blocks that it can compress compared to H.265. It cannot compress it as much. Then we have the H.264. The difference is that it will keep the iframe for even longer time. That means the whole image. It will compress the quality of the static areas compared to the moving areas. So it will even go compress it even more, all the way down to 90% of the storage space is saved, or the transmission as well. So the compression rate is much higher. The only downside of it is we are limited in terms of what analytics we are able to do. So I would prefer to go with H.265 with the variable bitrate. If you want to try to calculate how does it apply to my cameras or my setup, we have a disk calculator where we can choose Smart H.265, where we can choose the low, medium, and high environment dynamics, and then the resolution, the frame rate, and then we get the bit rate. We can calculate the storage space. We can calculate the bit rate as well. So that's a very nice tool for you guys. This is just an example where I was trying to compare the H.264 and H.265 as well. You could see during the night at 11 o'clock p.m., I'm running around on my children's toys, doing these different videos to give you an idea about the bit rate. So the bit rate is significantly lower on H.265. And you're going to be seeing 2600 kbps, which is okay. And there we go, all the way down. There you see me playing around 11 o'clock in my neighborhood. I'm sure people are thinking the people working in Dahua are mental, the different things, the tests they're doing so late. I don't know if you guys noticed something. If you notice that the bit rate for this one, for this camera, same resolution, comparing it with this camera when we even had movement over there, was significantly lower. Why? In this case, it's not the compression just, it's also the amount of static noise that we have in the image, because the more static noise, the more data, which is irrelevant, the more we have to store, the more we have to decode, the more capacity is needed. So if you have a very noisy picture, because you have a very small sensor and you don't get such a clear image, you will get a lot of insignificant data, which is useless. Instead, better low light performance sensors has less noise, less data. So instead of looking like before, it should look something like this during the day and during the night if it's with IR. So this was about the cameras. Let's go to the NVRs. I can see that we're going to be running out of time. I'm going to try to do it a little bit faster. So hope you guys could bear in mind with me. I don't remember. It might have been. It looks like it. It could have been anywhere. So Sometimes we get the question, why do I need a 4 series? Why do I need a 5 series? Do I need a 5 series with AI? Do I need an IVSS server? What are the main differences? What do I need to think about? Okay, first of all, to make it very clear, that's also why I made the table. I don't have to go through everything, but as you can see, for the 4 megapixel, we have the small white boxes. We also have the boxes that are a little bit, the bigger black boxes. I usually call the small white ones the lunch boxes. For small installations, they are great. They go all the way up to 80 megabits. So for 4-channel, 8-channel, that's usually more than enough as a input rate and recording rate. So if I use the 4 series, where they are not the small white lunch boxes, then we go all the way up to 200 Mbps. Because this is how we need to calculate if we have enough capacity to handle the resolutions that we are choosing for the NVRs. 5 series, we have a higher bit rate as well for recording. AI NVR, the only limit is that once we're using our AI features, then we are backend AI features, then we are limiting it to half of the bandwidth. And as you can see, the outgoing bandwidth is referred to if I'm using one NVR and connecting to a website that's pulling the stream from the NVR for some specific cameras. Then I'm using the bandwidth, the transmission, the outgoing bandwidth, or from one NVR to another NVR, that's the outgoing bandwidth. As you can see, it's significantly lower for the 4 series as well. Decoding capacity, which is important for people to understand, which is also one of the limits that I see sometimes people are choosing the wrong NVR or don't understand the capacity. It's because sometimes they are treating the NVRs either like a very, very, very strong VMS client, but if you compare these specifications to any other strong client VMS, generally you will see that you will get a much, much, much higher cost benefit effect from the NVRs than you would from any other client's VMS. As you can see, 4 channels, 4K or 16 channels with the 5 series. When we are talking about the live view, what happens usually is that whenever we surpass for the 5 series, for instance, we will surpass the 9 split, which is running the mainstream, which is running the highest quality of the camera. When we go to 16 split, then it's going to change it over to substream because the pictures are significantly smaller. So then the substream is enough. We can't even tell the difference from 1 megapixel or 4 megapixel anyway, since the pictures are so small. So that's why it makes sense, because you will have a better viewer experience. Once you double click the image, it will go up to mainstream. So therefore, the limitation is not visible once you do the live view. But once you do the playback, since we are only recording in mainstream, and if we are choosing all 16 channels, let's assume they're 4 megapixel, and we are doing the playback, the NVR will be limited because it cannot decode as much capacity. As you can see, if we are running the 4K, it's maximum 4 channels. So 8 megapixel times 4, that's the maximum capacity when you're doing the playback as well. And that's how you would see it. Then we go to the storage part. The maximum capacity for the disk to be able to handle whenever you're recording a lot of cameras is 32 channels of full HD per disk in an NVR. So if you have higher resolutions or more cameras than that, determined by the channels for that NVR you're choosing, make sure to choose the right amount of disks, or else you will end up, creating congestion, and you will have too much data trying to be written on one disk and reading from it at the same time while you're doing the playback, and the disk will start having a tough time. It will stop recording, stop recording. So therefore, in the bottom, I've listed the different features of the different NVRs in terms of what you get if you have a 4 megapixel, 4 series, 5 series, 5 series with AI or the IVSS. I'm not going to read through all of them, but as you can see in the bottom right side, I marked it with yellow, which shows the backend feature capacity of the NVR. So that means if you have a regular camera with no analytics, or even an RTSP stream or a ONVIF protocol, then you can use 4 channels for metadata collection. That means you get the human attributes, the car attributes, recorded directly in the NVR. So you can search for instance, a blue car or person wearing black jeans or a blue top or whatsoever. Or you can use 16 channels face detection, 4 channels face recognition. The difference between them is that you are capturing faces only with face detection. With recognition, you are comparing them within databases. So, and as you can see, 16 channels, SMD, we are talking about backend features. So if you have an old installation with lots of cameras that are not so intelligent, you can use this NVR and utilize all the analytics because they're done backend hand. And as you can see, it doesn't mean that you can use all of these backend features at the same time. You can use them one at a time. These are the maximum capacity for each one of these features. So, and you can go even higher if you're using the IVS, which is the analytics server. There is a capacity chart over here. I think it's here. A capacity chart which shows the different situations. For instance, let me just show you here, just an example. So over here, there are a lot of different features distinguished by models, the capacity, the resolution, also the mixed AI ability. That means if you have a couple of face recognition cameras or cameras that you want to use for face recognition, if you want to use a couple of channels for SMD or perimeter protection, there's a lot of different mixes over here that gives you some examples to reflect on, and that's already shared with you guys. So this was the NVD. One of the most important things to think about is make sure the capacity of the disks is not exceeded. So, and by the way, the capacity of each disk is all the way up to 10 TB per disk. And if you go for 5 series NVR, that's 80 TB. For one NVR, that's a lot of storage space. And if you're utilizing the right compression, the right bit rate, then you can get tons of recording out there. So, as I said before, sometimes we go mad scientist. We try to push our devices above the limits. And we did that in this case as well. So what I did was I took a 5 series AI NVR. And by the way, this is not recommended by any means. This is just an example of the power, the sheer strength of our NVR, how good it is. I took 32 channels, ran them with 8 megabits with constant bitrate, so that means constant pressure. 64 H.264 compression, that means the lowest compression that we have. Constant bitrate, as I said, constant recording, 1 TB hard disk. As I said, I wouldn't recommend this at all. By the way, a little while after, the disk started choking, so it was a little bit above the capacity, but as you could see from the chart, I'm way above the capacity. So apart from that, we did playback as well. During that, we were using all the backend analytics enabled and decoding by 34 channels substream in one NVR. So if that doesn't say anything about the capacity, I don't know what does. Thanks a lot, Chris. I'll talk to you later. We are almost done. So this is how it looked when I pushed the NVR above the limits. And to me, it was shocking, the fact that it could actually take care of so many cameras. As you can see from the video, that's the proof. I filled up the dynamics, running a music video on the back of the screen. So it was really under a lot of pressure, but still the NVR didn't give up. As you can see, the bitrate, it's under a massive amount of pressure, and it was running like, I think the NVR didn't have any problem whatsoever. We ran it for 2 weeks. The disk started having problems, started choking, but the NVR was doing an excellent job. So this was just to demonstrate the sheer power of an NVR, how strong it is. If try to compare that with any VMS client or server by any means, and try to compare the price level of it. I'm quite sure, and I could be quite confident, I think if you add a 0 to it at the end of the cost for an NVR compared to a client, still it's not as strong as the NVR. For some of you guys who've been working with a lot of VMSs, you guys know what I'm talking about, right? Great. We are a little bit behind schedule, but let me just go through some of these frequently asked questions, which I think are necessary. Can I connect one NVR to another to display record cameras from the main NVR. So that means, let's assume I have an NVR here in my training room, and let's assume I have another location where I want to have my cameras connected from one NVR to the other NVR just to display them over there in the other office because I want to have the live view of it. Yes, or it could be another office in the same network, doesn't matter. Yes, the transmission capacity is the limit. That means the transmission we were talking about, how much it can forward. So in the small lunch boxes, it was somewhat some 80 megabits. So this is important to think about. You're not able to change any rules, the IVS settings or the recording settings of the main NVR. So this is just important. Only displaying and recording for constant, that's possible. Then we have, can I connect an ePoE switch to an ePoE output of the NVR? Anybody tried that? Or anybody have been thinking about that? No, it's not possible because it's designed as one PoE port output from the NVR for one camera because it's assigning a PoE address for each port. That's also why it's so, user-friendly where it's plug and play, because once you change your camera from one port to another, it's just going to assign another IP address. So it's not just going to MAC lock this camera to one port only. So don't connect a switch to it and then a couple of cameras, because if you think about it, if the camera is assigning one IP address per port, then it's going to be confused once you add a switch, which IP or which camera should I assign this IP for? Then you could be cheeky and say like, but I'm going to define the IPs by myself, but it's going to be in the same range with the NVR's PoE switch range. So then it's going to be fine. No, in fact not, because the NVR is going to decide by itself which camera is going to get this IP. Then you will have a lot of conflicts. So one channel of output to one camera. Why is my playback limited or unstable? Decoding capacity is above the limit. Playback less cameras simultaneously, as I said before. This is usually the reason, because you are exceeding the decoding capacity of the NVR. My time is not correct on the cameras or the NVR. Make sure the NTP and the DSC are enabled, and all the cameras are enabled as a time sync for the NVR. You can do that in the NVR settings. You can also sync the time with the NTP directly from the config tool. So make sure that the timing is correct. It's very important for analytics. It's very important for proof as well. How do I know if it's big enough, the disk, you know? As I said, storage calculation by the tool, and also look at the chart that I said before in the terms of the capacity, the maximum capacity. In the NVRs, in the latest firmwares for like half a year ago, we started adding a feature where it says record estimate in the storage section, where you can estimate the recording days of this size of a disk with these different settings for your cameras right now. Then you can have a very easy calculation instead of going like, let's go with the 4 TB disk. So instead of that, calculate your storage, save some money if you don't need such a big storage, because you understand the compression and the bitrate as well. If my recording is chopping, why? Try turning down sometimes the resolution, the frame rate, the bitrate, just in order to try to see, is it the limitation on the NVR, the transmission, or the capacity, the decoding, or maybe remove a couple of cameras to see if it has an effect in order to pinpoint it, because we want to isolate the challenge little by little by removing some of this stuff. Cannot add a new IPC to an old NVR. What's the solution for it? Start by upgrading the NVR to a newer firmware, factory defaulted, and add the IPC by initializing directly from the NVR. Because if you have a very old firmware that is not supporting the high security, that was usually, I think it was in the middle of 2017, where we released a high security firmware which has different levels of security, which were significantly higher than the previous. Therefore, you need to factory default the settings of it. Cannot add an old IPC to a new NVR. Start by upgrading the IPC before the NVR, and then initialize. That's the way to go about. December, yeah, might be, yeah, sorry, my bad. Hi, Ellie, slipped? Not sure I know what you mean, Palette. How do I know if the camera can recognize at the right distance? Use the Dory table that's in the back of the catalog of our IP cameras and CVI cameras, or use the tool that we have, the camera calculator, in terms of determining the distance for the specific amount of pixels that's needed for the specific distance for identification. So pixels per meters, the tool for pixels per meter calculation can be used from the toolbox already. My cameras are disconnected from the NVR all the time. What could be the issue? A lot of different issues. It could be IP conflicts. Make sure that the camera IPs are not the same. Usually that's not a situation you will meet if you're using the built-in PoE, but rather if you use separated PoE switches where you are defining the IP addresses by yourself. Bandwidth congestion. Make sure that you are not pulling in too much bandwidth. Try to decrease the amount of camera or the bandwidth, the bitrate of the cameras from the NVR, or check up on your infrastructure. Make sure your wiring, your switches are suitable for that amount of camera. If you are upgrading with more and more camera, think about that before upgrading, or else you'll just have an unhappy customer. Could also be the PoE budget. If you look at the NVR, built-in NVR, you have a maximum PoE budget that says I think it's 25.5 watt per port. But the maximum capacity for the NVR is 160 watts for the 5 series NVR. And if you're using above that, then obviously the cameras are going to start disconnecting. And the way to calculate the best way is go to the camera's data sheets, look at the maximum consumption in watts, calculate from that. Don't do it from what you could see right now, what it's using right now, because you're usually installing cameras during the day. During the night, usually cameras would use more watts because they're running the IR, and you will have a limitation there. So make sure you go to the datasheet, calculate the complete budget of all those cameras you installed in order to see if it matches the capacity of the NVR, or else you're just gonna have an unhappy customer again. So do your homework well. Do I need to use a CCTV PoE switch? Yes, because they are built for CCTV. The reason why they are so much better is because they have a larger buffer. You will avoid a lot of congestions when you are using PoE switches built for CCTV. Better temperature ranges as well, because obviously if the temperature range is too low, the temperature is at the limit for the environment, then the switch will not perform as good. But PoE for CCTV are running with a wider range. The capacity for viewing in at the limit for HDMI output. So when you have sometimes the NVR connected to a monitor and you are meeting the limit, the capacity limit, where it says decoding capacity exceeded, then some NVRs, if you want to exceed that, then usually we would prefer to use an NVD that's built for decoding. The smallest NVD has 4 outputs, 4 HDMI outputs, where you can connect one screen to each, and then you can decode even more cameras. And you can connect the cameras directly to that one or through the NVR. Just think about the transmission bandwidth if you're doing it through the NVR. So they come with lots of different ranges. You can have as big a video wall as you would like to when you're talking about the decoding capacity. Is the decoding capacity separated for HDMI 2 on bigger NVRs? If you're using a 5 series NVR with a network video decoder, exactly. If you're using the HDMI with 4 discs, the NVR with 4 discs, the 5 series, then you have 2 HDMI outputs, which you can separate it however you want to use them. But the maximum decoding capacity you saw from the previous table is referring to this maximum already. So that means you cannot exceed that. This limit goes for both NVR HDMIs combined. Yeah. Why not just use constant bitrate with higher Mbps? The wasted amount of space is more, so the storage NVR capacity is not used optimally. I think that's very clear for everybody. I hope so, at least. And I don't know if anybody has more questions. I would have loved to add them to it. So Before we end the session today, we have a Q&A time. Do we have any questions? And don't leave if you don't have any questions. I have some sharing information for you at the end. Yes, let me hear it, Pelle. Okay, great. Okay. So one question is, let me start by Dino's question. What settings do I have to do front end? That is a very wide definition. If you're talking about the bitrate, the compression and everything, you can do all of it from the NVR. So that doesn't have to be done from the camera. If we are talking about the exposure time, the shutter speed, that can only be done directly from the camera's live view. Let me just log into the camera. Let's just see if I have the time for it. Else, Dino, I would love to show you in the camera if you're thinking about the shutter speed. I hope that answers your question. So another question, wouldn't a small LED light inside the casing and the light sensor be a solution to that? Depending on to what? If you have a small LED light, some models, some of these full color models or very low light performance models, you can buy them with white LED already. So that's not going to be an issue. You can just buy them with white LED and then you'll get a colored image even if it's pitch black. So I hope that answers the question. Or if you had a small amount of light outside, that's usually enough. So determining the more sensitive your sensor is, the wider the aperture is, the more you can utilize that small amount of light that you're projecting. The opposite, on the contrary, the smaller the sensor and so on, the more light you have to set up in order to get the same type of performance. I hope that answers the question. Another question is, in what menu do I adjust the shutter speed? Yeah, let me just show you really quickly. Let me just show you guys. I guess you guys can see my screen right now, right? Okay, great. So when I'm in my conditions, I'm in my camera settings here, I go to my conditions and then I go to in my backlight, I can enable these WVDR functions, SSA and so on I talked about. Then I have my exposure settings. In my auto, I can enable it and choose shutter priority. And here I'm able to choose the shutter speed. If I increase the shutter speed, you can see it gets darker. But if I move my hand like this and look at the playback of the recording, then it's going to be very crystal clear from my hand movement. But if I had a very short exposure time, then it would be much worse. So there you see what I was talking about. The front end question is more for TIAC and other special cameras. Most of the cameras are supported directly to be configured from the NVR, so no worries there. Let me go back to the questions. So camera firmwares, usually we would refer to our international website to find all the latest camera firmwares. If you have some camera firmwares that are hard to find, we are working on it. Unfortunately, we haven't been as successful. Let us know, create a ticket in our ticket system and we'll make sure to support you there. And whenever we have a, general question from many customers or a, very commonly used camera, then we'll make sure to add it to our distributor so they will have the firmware as well. So I hope that answers your question. So if we don't have any more questions, just a sec, let me just go over here. Let me just go over here to our chat. Okay, so if we don't have any more questions, Thank you guys for joining in. I'm very happy that you joined in. I hope it added to some of your knowledge. I'm sorry that the time was exceeded a little bit. I hope you guys can forgive me. So I hope it was useful for you. I hope it took you a little bit back to the roots, how to understand, and you learned something about the common mistake people usually do, or what things to configure in a better way. So before leaving, I have this, just like, you know, we get a lot of different requirements from different customers in terms of webinars, and when is there going to be another webinar? Just like Netflix, we would love for you guys to join our next webinar. That's going to be in only 7 days, which goes through the hands-on operation. So some of you guys who have been to the workshop, hands-on workshop here in my office, have already tried some of it. But some of you guys who don't or wanted just to refresh it, or doesn't know how to start up an NVR, go through the initialization, go through the different processes I need to do in order to, for instance, set up my motion detection recording. How do I set it up? How do I make sure my NVR is running well? This webinar is for you guys. So make sure to join in on that one, subscribe. I didn't make a link for it yet. I'm going to do it in today. So I'm going to make a link and you guys can join in, and that's going to be back to the basics of CCTV part 2. So 7 days, and we're going to do another one a couple of days after, as you can see, the 23rd of March, and then again the 25th of March. So if you thought this was great and you want to move to the next step about let's go down to the configuration part, then this webinar is definitely going to be for you. And if you guys didn't notice, we are on YouTube. So we have a YouTube channel called Dahua Nordic. So all these trainings, all these different tests and advertisements and these promotion videos are being added to our Dahua Nordic subscription page on YouTube. So go ahead, subscribe there. You'll be able to see all the new content over there. And last but not least, my information on LinkedIn, if you want to connect, if you want to discuss something that you didn't agree with, or if there was something you wanted me to explain a little bit deeper, I'm available. So go ahead and add me, and then let's keep up. And we have a Facebook. If you're not already following it, you should definitely do it, because this is also where we send out the invitations for the registration of our webinars, events, so on and so on. Not just Facebook, also LinkedIn as well.